Yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome to day 6, our final day, uh, interestingly, of game theory. Today, we're going to be talking about uncertainty, information, um, uncertainty and information, as well as risk. Um, Alrighty. So, imperfect information, if you recall from, this is very annoying. Give me a second. I'm very sorry. What's going on? So imperfect information, if you recall from our first class, is one of the main things that you have to inspect while looking at a game. And basically it means that people have different varying levels of information during the game. So this causes risk, right? If you don't know everything, you have to take chances and you can't you can't calculate that, oh, this is going to happen, thus this is my optimal result because, it might not happen. So when you have imperfect information and when you have risk, there are three main ways to deal with it. So the first one is to share the risk with others. Second one is to pay to reduce risk. And the third is to manipulate risk. So first, sharing risk. So farmer A thinks that their wheat crops may do poorly this year, and farmer B thinks that their corn crops may do poorly this year. So they basically just pool their money, right? They say, okay, if somebody does poorly, then the farmer who does better off will loan some money, right? So, but if that's only the case if one farmer does well and one farmer does poorly. If both farmers do well, they don't really need to share anything. And if both farmers do poorly, I guess they're, up a creek without a paddle. So, does everybody understand this? And if everybody does understand this, what are some examples you can think of sharing risk to mitigate risk? Which I was going to say that rhymes, and then I realized that I rhymed risk with risk. So that's not great. Does everybody understand like what the question is? And am I audible? Okay. Okay. Um, hmm. I'm trying to think of some. I mean, there's a bunch of very general, similar examples, such as, just basically this, but instead of farmers, you have different professions. But I'm trying to think of something slightly more unique. Like, of course, I could say, oh, instead of farmers, they're bankers or something. And, if they don't do well, then the bankers just share their money or something of the sort. But I kind of want to make something a bit more interesting, which is hard. I think people get it, so I'm just going to move on. Okay, paying to reduce risk. Farmer A thinks that their wheat crops may do poorly this year, so Farmer A buys some insurance, right? They pay some money so that if they get, screwed, then they'll get some compensation from the insurance company. Basically, what this does is that it uh, hopefully it keeps the same expected payoff, right? If he doesn't get insurance, maybe the weighted average would be something, and if he does get insurance, the weighted average might be the same thing. But because he's paying money, and if nothing happens, he's just lost that. Maybe there's simply a lower standard deviation. So that's what paying to reduce risk might do. Okay. Okay. There's a 50% chance that a ball is going to drop on you, hurting your arm, and there's a 50% chance the ball will drop on your classmate, hurting their arm. If one of you hurts your arm but the other doesn't, then the one with both arms can donate an arm. Yeah, exactly. That's a good example of sharing risk. Okay, so what are some examples you can think of for paying to reduce risk? Which is, I mean, just a fancy way of saying insurance. So, do you guys have any ideas? Again, this is the kind of thing where it's like, oh, we want just insurance, but maybe there's some slightly more interesting examples. I think somebody accidentally unmuted, unless they're going to say something in which they didn't accidentally unmute. Okay, does anybody have any ideas for this? And does, okay. Yeah. Getting car insurance in case you get an accident or you do something suboptimal, shall we say. Yeah, that's a good example, right? Yeah, car insurance is the most obvious example. Okay, manipulating risk. Farmer A thinks that their wheat crop may do poorly this year, so farmer A is going to plant some corn as well. And this is pretty straightforward, right? If you think that one option might, end in disaster, instead you decide to do both things. So once again, does everybody understand? And does anybody have any other examples? I'm going to continue asking the same thing. Does everybody understand what I'm asking and everybody understand what's on the slide? Okay. I guess this one's a kind of hard one to come up with an example with. Okay. So, banana salesman thinks that Cavendish banana may die due to blight because all bananas are basically genetically the same. So, that's a fun fact. So, they grow the smallest bananas as well in order to combat this. Yeah, that's a good example. Okay. What about farmer using pesticide or insecticide to help prevent his crops from being damaged by insects? So I'm going to slightly change that. So suppose the farmer thinks that a bunch of insects are going to come and ruin all of his crops, right? But if he simply covers all of his crops with, if so, if all of his crops are not, covered in insecticide, and they do get eaten by insects, then he's not going to have a good time because he's not going to have any crops. However, if he covers all of his crops in insecticide, then maybe he can only sell his crops for a fraction of what they are worth if he didn't cover them in insecticide. So perhaps to manipulate risk, he could cover some of his plants with insecticide and not cover some of his plants with insecticide, so that he can maximize how much money he's going to make. That's both that and this example of manipulating risk are basically just examples of hedging your bets, if you know what that is. Okay, so people are giving good examples. Okay, asymmetric information. This is kind of the more pertinent part of what we're going to talk about. I don't know if pertinent is the right word. It's the more directly related. Okay, If a player has different knowledge of a situation, both of them can use different tactics to assist them. So a more knowledgeable player can conceal information or reveal misleading information. Or they can instead choose to reveal selectively correct information. And then a less knowledgeable player can try to, elicit or get information and, kind of filter between what is a lie and what is true. And they can also instead choose to remain ignorant. Maybe knowing some stuff will kind of make, if both players know that one player knows something, then they can get more ideas, I guess, is a way of putting it. It's kind of like the acting irrational thing from last class. That's one way you can use remaining ignorant to assist you. So, does everybody understand? And does anybody have any examples of people, using asymmetric information to their advantage? Okay, I see one very obvious example that I'll talk about last, unless people don't say anything. It's the very standard answer, and it's a very good answer. There's a reason it's so standard. So, does anybody else have any examples? Okay, I guess I'll just talk about poker right now. Yeah, poker is a very good example. In that game, rather than people having kind of different amounts of information, it's just generally people have the same amounts of information, but they have to work with it, right? So they can, conceal. In general, people are only going to really conceal information, right? They're going, but because information is revealed, to all players, the cards in the if you're playing Texas Hold'em, there's cards in the middle, and if you're playing standard 5 card, I don't know if you reveal the cards you discard, but it doesn't really matter. You are concealing information in poker, and you're kind of trying to figure out correct things. Unfortunately, I don't. I think I played code names like once. Uh, But isn't that a game where there's like some code masters and then there's some people trying to figure out the code? Am I right about that? Because if it is, then it's a good example of asymmetric information. Because these code masters, they know how the code works, and they're going to conceal information from players who are not on their team, and maybe reveal misleading information to players who also aren't on their team. And the people with less information are going to try to filter all these incorrect facts and such. So yes, direct communication. So this is just cheap talk again, right? Words by themselves aren't very credible because they don't have any backing. You're just saying something. So communication without any cost is called cheap talk, and an equilibrium using communication is called the cheap talk equilibrium. So cheap talk equilibrium really only exists if the interests are aligned. Okay, I had this question last time. Let's see if anybody remembers it again. What's the name of this game? I don't really care if you remember it or not, the name, because and you might, and that's good. But if you don't, I'm not gonna, yell at you. Assurance, great. Okay, basically what this is, no, you forgot the E, haha. If because both players have aligned interests, they can clearly figure out which option is better for them, right? They're going to talk and they say, okay, tennis is better for both of us. However, in this fake game I made up, this is just some random game. It's not anything important. Players do not have aligned interests. Give me a second. What's the Nash here? You know what? Quick pop quiz. Find the Nash here. Nash equilibrium here. I forgot to find it. Okay, let me, I had to temporarily put away chat. Okay, so let's look at this game. Once again, I think people are slightly confused. Um, okay, so if let's again start at player A's, position. So if player B were to choose left, if player B were to choose left, player A would choose down, right? 9 versus 5. And if player B were to choose right, then player A would choose up, 8 versus 2. Now let's look at player B. If player A were to go up, then player B would choose left, 5 versus 2. And if player A were to choose down, player B would choose right, 1 versus 8. So that means that there's no Nash equilibrium. Yeah. So everybody get it? And does everybody understand why their interests aren't aligned, right? This because, not only is there no Nash, but even if there was one, hypothetically, if we change the numbers slightly, um, they can't really agree on a specific option. So everybody understand? Another example of a good game that has conflicting interests is Battle of the Sexes. So everybody, I didn't forget to make a slide, but I'm only thinking of it now. Everybody remember what Battle of the Sexes is? Or do I have to quickly re-explain it? I don't know if I'm pretty sure those yeses were from the does everybody understand? So okay, another yes, great. I'm gonna quickly. The question is more so: should I go over it in uber detail or should I just give a gist? Okay, there's two people. Both people prefer an option, but they don't prefer the same option. So long as they choose the same option, they both get some payoff, but the person who prefers that option will get more payoff. And if they don't do the same thing, then they don't get any payoff. That's a good example when there's multiple Nash equilibria conflicting interest because they can't, they both have a preferred Nash equilibrium, one in which they get higher payoff. So that's a good example of, conflicted interests. Okay. Adverse selection. So this is kind of a pivot. So suppose that you're trying to select the best people for a job, right? You're like, okay, I want all of the best electricians around. So you get a pool of electricians, and they all say, oh, yeah, I'm one of the best electricians around. Trust me, right? Once again, cheap talk doesn't mean anything. So you have to figure out how do I assess which one of these electricians is actually going to help and which one of these electricians does not know the first thing about electricity. So the two kinds of selection are signaling and screening. So let's go into both. Signaling. I took the nice Wikipedia definition. Okay. It is a game with two players called the sender, the person who's signaling, and the receiver, the person who's emitting. So we have the electricians, who are senders, and the receiver, the electrician consultant. I don't know. So the sender has one of several types. The sender can either be, good or bad, right? In some simple cases, but generally the sender's type is T, and it'll determine the payoff function of the sender. It is the private information of the sender. It is not known by the receiver. The electrician knows, am I a good electrician, or do I not know how a light switch works? So that is something known by the electrician, but not by the employer. The receiver only has a single type, employer. So by assumption of common priors, the payoff function is known by both players. That's a fancy way of saying both players know what's going to happen if the employer gets a good electrician and if the employer gets a bad electrician, right? If the employer gets a good one, they'll say, wow, thanks for fixing my lights. And if they get a bad electrician, they say, okay, I'm switching to candles now. So it's known by both players what this means. So the game has two steps. First, the sender plays the first step. They can play one of several actions, which are called messages. The set of possible messages is the sets M1, M2, M3, up to MI. That just basically means they can do different things. That's all that means. The receiver plays the second step. After viewing the sender's message, they choose their action. A1, A2, A3, up to AK. Once again, that's just a fancy way of saying the employer can do something. So the two players receive payoffs depending on the sender's type, the message chosen by the sender, and the action chosen by the receiver. Basically, what this means is that the receiver is trying to create a system such that given this different things that the sender can signal, if they signal incorrectly, it'll be worse off for them. Basically, what this means is that the receiver is going to make a game that basically goes along the lines of if you are a bad electrician and you say that you are a bad electrician, we're not going to pay you, right? None of us will get any payoff. If you are a bad electrician and you say that you're a good electrician, then when we hire you, we are going to get screwed because you are a bad electrician, but we are going to screw you back with a lawsuit. You can't falsely claim that you know what you're doing. If you are a good electrician who claims that they're bad, sorry, being humble isn't going to get you anyway, and we're not going to hire you because we didn't know. And if you were a good electrician who is actually a good electrician, thanks for fixing our lights. You're going to get paid like you're supposed to, and we're going to have our lights, working. So does everybody understand how signaling works, first of all? And can anybody come up with some examples of signaling? I'm going to give you guys probably slightly more time to come up with examples because, my example's relatively long and I have it ready. So it's going to take even more time for you guys to come up with an answer. So first, does everybody understand? I'm going to wait for some yeses. Come on, even one person saying yes is fine. Although I prefer if more people said yes. Okay, yes, I see a yes, I think. 7:32. Okay, cool. All right, now that at least one person understands, can you come up with some examples for signaling? I'll give you guys a couple more minutes. Somebody says that they understand but can't come up with one. But even if you come up with a bad one, that's fine. Even if you come up with an incredibly simple one. I'll give you until 7:36. I guess this is kind of a hard thing to come up with an example for, so maybe we should just move on. Okay, people seem to understand, but it is a kind of a long thing, so let's continue. Screening. There we are. Screening. A screening game, this is the massive Wikipedia definition. It's not great. A screening game is a two-player principal agent type game, ignore that, using economic and game theoretical modeling. Principal agent problems, ignore that word, are situations where there are two players whose interests are not necessarily matching with each other, but where complete honesty is not optimal for one player. Fancy way of saying, oh, that's when people don't have the same information and when lying might be good. This will lead to strategies where the players exchange information based on their actions with some degree of noisy. The ambiguity prevents other players from taking advantage of the first. That is one of the worst Wikipedia definitions I've ever heard. It's just long and unnecessarily complicated. Basically, let me kind of explain it. So once again, we are an employer searching for the best electricians in the land, right? So we get a bunch of electricians, but instead of accepting applications up front, we're instead going to do as follows. We're going to take all of the electricians and we're going to say, hey, Mr. Electrician, if you're so good at electricity, here is a light bulb. How does it work? For example, that I feel like not, I mean, people other than electricians know that answer, but basically what that means is the person who has less information is going to do an action that, depending on what kind of, what category the other person belongs to, they're going to react differently, right? So a bad electrician will fumble around with the light bulb and maybe will break it. But a good electrician will say, oh, that's a light bulb. If you turn it on, it makes light. So that's what screening is. Okay. So does everybody understand how screening works? I'll get somebody put an example of how signaling works, and I'll look to that afterwards. But does everybody understand how screening works? Okay, great. So let me look at this example of signaling. Somebody did, and then we'll get back to screening. Okay. You're wondering whether you should buy a certain type of lawnmower. If the lawnmower is marketed as bad, but is actually good, or if it is marketed as bad and is bad, it will not be bought. If it is marketed as good but is bad, a lawsuit will be filed. And if it is marketed as good, it will be bought and no issues will be risen. Yeah, that's it's a fine example of signaling. I get, yeah, that's fine because the seller is signaling, if their lawnmower is good, that's a perfectly fine example of signaling. Okay, so screening is making them actually do something that they claim they can. That's a very obvious example. The reason the Wikipedia definition is so vague is, once again, because you can apply it to a whole lot of stuff. Basically, it's saying the uninformed person, the employer, is going to do something. And then depending on what category the more informed people are, they are going to, do something, right? So if you want, the reason I give this example is because that's kind of abstract and hard to understand, but that's basically what that means. So while making them do something that they can claim to do is a good example of screening. Screening is a much more broad idea. But does everybody understand? I already asked that, but do people have any other examples? And also, did I answer your question? Are examples too hard to come up with for this one, or like should I move on? I guess is the question. No one's saying anything, so say something in the next 5 seconds. 5, 4. You mow a lawn with a special lawnmower to see if it is good. Be more specific, I guess. I guess that's an example of screening. Yeah, it's a kind of obvious, but it's a good example. It's basically saying, hey, I'm going to test the lawnmower to see if it's garbage or not. That's a good example of screening. Yes. Okay. And if it's not good, then you say, no, get out. So yeah, that's a good example. Okay. So how do we use adverse selection? So this is kind of the things I've been explaining. So consider two kinds of people. Low-skilled people and high-skilled people. Now consider two kinds of jobs, low-skilled jobs and high-skilled jobs. As the employer, we want as many high-skilled people and as few low-skilled people to do the high-skilled job. So how are we going to do this? Does anybody have any ideas? Yeah, it is screening, but let's be a bit more specific, I guess. I wish I had water, but I don't. Okay. Screen them at what they're supposed to do to be able to do the job. This will separate the skilled from the unskilled people. Yes, exactly. That's one way of doing it. Let's see what I wrote. Okay, so let's create a prerequisite such that low-skilled people, while trying to meet the prerequisite, lose enough payoff that they do not want the high-skilled job, but rather the low-skilled job. High-skilled people should still want the high-skilled job rather than the low-skilled job. Basically, this is just my definition for screening was kind of a more, I guess, conceptual one, but if you want to do it in terms of payoff, what screening really is going to do is that it is going to create a situation in which your payoff hopefully lowers to the degree such that they will not want to do that job, right? So suppose we are going to create a kind of a, hey, this is a little bit of a training course you had to do in our, to do our job, right? We look at all the electricians and we say, hey, if you, study, if you can pass this test, then, you will get admitted. Now, for a low skill electrician, passing this test is going to be very hard, right? They're going to have to study a lot and they're going to waste a lot of time. And hopefully they'll waste enough time such that if they were to do the high skill job, they would lose, payoff as compared to doing the low skill job where they don't have to do the test. But for a high skill electrician, the test will be easy enough such that they don't lose that much time studying for the test and taking the test. So that's how you would do this. Okay, so does everybody understand all of that? Alrighty, I see a yes. So we're kind of done now. That was the last bit of game theory. We're not done. Don't leave. I have things to discuss. So we've kind of finished our study in game theory, but now that the class is done, what could you do? I mean, I have other things to do, but what can you do? Well, let's look at a couple things you can investigate. Auctions. Auctions are fun. I'm a huge fan of auctions. So, what kinds of auctions are there? There's a lot. How do they operate? In a variety of different ways. What kinds of auctions benefit the buyer and what kinds of auctions benefit the seller? Because, depending on how you do the auction, people are going to, strategize how they pay in different ways. What auctions make people bid honestly and what auctions make people think about, cheating a little bit, not paying what they think the full price of the item is. So, the reason auctions are kind of interesting in game theory, I think they're more interesting in game theory than they are in real life, is because in real life, people overbid, which is a terrible thing. Do not overbid. Before you get into that auction, decide this is my maximum price. I am not paying any more than this. So, yeah. The three kinds of, so there's basically four auctions I can think off the top of my head. I don't remember all the properties of all of them because it's been a quick second. So there's normal auctions, there's an item, say, hey, I'm selling this pen. Who wants it? And everybody gives their price. That is actually probably worse for the seller and slightly better for the buyer, right? If one buyer, if nobody wants an item, and if people want the item less than the buyer, and if they can only sell for a little bit, then the buyer is basically going to get screwed. However, if the buyer, if the seller likes it a lot less than the buyer, then it might be the other way around. Another auction is called the Dutch auction. Basically, I say, all right, this pen, we're starting it at $1 trillion, and I'm going to lower it by $100 every, second. And then whenever somebody, slams the I'm going to buy that button, they pay that much. That incentivizes, kind of scouting out the area, because in that case, you can kind of hopefully figure out a way that you don't have to pay the maximum. So those are two kind of different auctions. Should I say the other two? How much time do we have? 10 minutes. I'll go over them briefly. The other auctions are sealed bid. The first kind of sealed bid auction is basically just, hey, I'm selling this pen. How much are you going to pay for it? Write it on a note, put it in a box. And then whoever pays the most is going to get the item, and they pay that much. That incentivizes people to kind of figure out how much other people are going to do. So that, incentivizes the buyer to cheat a little bit. Now, the second kind of sealed bid is, hey, here's this pen, write how much you're going to pay for it. Whoever writes the most is not going to pay what they wrote, but they are going to pay what the second highest person wrote. So that actually makes you, not cheat. What's the point of cheating, right? If you write, you still won't write over, because if you write over what it's worth for you, you might actually get screwed and have to pay, something that's would otherwise beat your bid, right? And if you bid under, you're not going to get it. But if you bid at exactly what you want, you are actually still going to get a good deal because you're necessarily paying less than what you would have wanted to. So those are the four most obvious auctions. I really quickly went over them. I think auctions are cool. So that's definitely something you should look at. Voting. What kinds of voting exist? A lot. Way too many to get into. I spent way too much time on auctions. Let's move on. How do they work? Self-explanatory. Is there a voting system that is more fair than the others? No. Uh, don't let anybody tell you like, oh, if we're voting for class president, that oh, we shouldn't use this. This is more fair. It probably isn't. Basically, any voting method. This is where the fixed versus not fixed rules enters the most. If you recall from first day, you can basically rig any voting system, no matter how you do it. If it's not just two people, then it is very easy to rig, right? If it's three people, different voting systems are going to incentivize different things. It is a wild thing. If you have more than three people, it gets, it's very easy to rig elections. That's being perfectly legitimate. You don't need to be a hacker to rig an election. You just need to know game theory. So if any of you are up to rigging an election, learn how voting works. Repeated games. Can games be repeated meaningfully? Some can, some can't. What should players do to benefit total payoff over the entire course of multiple games? Are they going to change their strategy for multiple times? Does the number of games matters? Yes, it does. In short, but the only difference is is there a finite number of games and is there an infinite number of games? So repeated Prisoner's Dilemma is the most obvious one, but other games can also be repeated, and those are also fun. Evolutionary games are a pain, in my opinion. I personally didn't like it. I don't remember how well I did on that test, but I think COVID happened right as that test, right like 2 days after that test happened. So I think he didn't grade it, which really helped my grade in that class. So given enough time and several kinds of players with different strategies, how many of each kind of player will exist in the steady state? Steady state's basically just if you run it a bajillion times, what's it kind of averaging out at? So it's just a lot. It's just a specific kind of repeated game. I'm not a fan, but you might be. Don't let my lack of enthusiasm discourage you, because it is cool. Angel problem. We already did this. Stable matching. Stable matching is fun. I'm a huge fan of stable matching. Let me pull up. So I actually did my final presentation, not in game theory, but in linear algebra, because basically the linear algebra teacher just said, okay, do a final presentation on anything remotely math related. And I chose stable matching. So let me open up the presentation. I did this with some other people. So I'm going to skip the slide that says their names, although, it says their last names. So. And for some reason, there are two introduction slides. I'm just noticing that. Okay, percent. Alrighty, let me pull up chat. There, I can see you now. Is it gonna load? Or, here we are. So stable marriage problem. Basically, why did it start on that slide? That's weird. Okay. Okay, there we are. That's better. Sorry. All right, stable marriage problem. So here's what we define. So we define a marriage as the union between, we consider a group of n men and n women. They have to be the same. A marriage is a set of pairings such that each man is paired exactly with one woman, and which each woman is paired with exactly one man. So no polygamy, right? And each one of these pairings is called a couple. So notice that the marriage is not the actual binding between two people, but is the total sets of these bindings, and each individual binding is called a couple. So what makes a marriage stable, right? So each man and each woman ranks each other in preference. We're assuming that there aren't any, LGBTQ people. So we define they're all gonna, only men want to be with women and only women want to be with men. So a rogue couple is a man and a woman who are not married to each other, but both prefer each other over their spouse, right? So in this case, we have man M1 and woman W1, and they are, in a couple, and we have man M2 and woman W2. But M2 and W1 actually prefer each other over their current spouses, right? Not a spouse, pairing. So that is considered a rogue couple. And a stable marriage is a set of marriages without any of those. So that's actually pretty straightforward. So unstable and stable marriages. So let's quickly look. Do I really care enough to demonstrate this? Okay, so no, this is going to take too long. Okay, so this is kind of a nice visual representation of it. So if we're looking at this, so M1 is fine with W1, M4 is fine with W4, but M2 prefers W3 over and M over W2, and W3 prefers M3 over M2 over M3. There's a lot of different things you do with this. Does the stable marriage always exist? Yes. I'm not going to go over all of this. This is a lot of text, not fun, not fun. There's an upper bound. That's cool. So does the order in which men propose matter? Who is better off, men or the woman? There's a lot of different things you can do with this. There's hospital residency problem. There's stable roommate problem, which, fun fact, doesn't always have a solution. So yeah, it basically the difference between hospital residency and stable marriage is that instead of there being two groups, now everybody is rating every other person, but that doesn't always actually have a stable match, because if everybody just despises one person, then there's always going to be a non-stable pairing. So I guess I kind of meandered for too long. I guess that's kind of it. I don't really have anything else to say. If anybody has any really last minute questions, say them now. Like, they don't even have to be game theory, topic related. If you have just any general questions about, like, oh, how do I, do this to learn more or something? I don't really. No, you don't even have to ask game theory related questions, hypothetically. I don't know. I'm not going to impose a time limit. But if you have any questions, say them now or forever hold your peace. Does anybody have any questions at all? Okay. Last chance. Okay. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. This was the worst way of counting. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.